Welcome back to the studio. Today I thought I would show you something. It's not what we're going to be working on today, but it is floating around my studio, so I thought I would show you. I started quilting around 1991, and one of the first things that I really loved about quilting was the applique. I had tried drawing, painting, oil painting, acrylic painting, and I couldn't get the idea in my mind to come out through my hands. I just wasn't very good at it. But I learned with applique that I could get a pretty close representation of what I wanted from stitching rather than trying to draw. And so I was drawn to applique right away. And my applique teacher was Bernina, who's passed away many years ago, but her applique class was hearts. And the reason she used a heart, as many teachers do, is because it had inward curve, or the inward point, the outward point, the straight line, and a curve, all in one shape. So it was something that she taught over and over again for her basic applique class. And she herself made thousands of hearts over the years. She would get a collection of fabrics and make hearts, and then she would send those blocks off to her sister, and her sister would piece them together and sometimes quilt them. So she had all kinds of themes of hearts. So in that same vein, I did class with her, and then I did a Christmas heart quilt. Now, like I said, this would have been probably like 1992, somewhere right around there that I started applique. So you can see that my applique is not very good. Some of the curves are less than curved, they're a little bit pointy. Anyway, I made this Christmas little wall hanging and I gave it to my sister. The funny thing is that all I did, because I wouldn't have known how to do any kind of free motion quilting, I would have just had a 1090 Bernina at that point. No free motion quilting skills. So all I did was quilt in the ditch of each square. That was it. And the batting is a little bit puffy. I can't tell what it is. But what I think is the really funny thing, it looks like it's some kind of a poly blend. The thing that I think is really funny is rather than putting a binding on this quilt, I made like a ruffle. And there's nothing inside the ruffle. It's just empty. And I just folded that fabric over and then blind stitched it very poorly, I might add, to the back, kind of in the way that you would a binding, but it's just a big empty ruffle. Well, over the years this ruffle is completely separated on the back side where I hand stitched it, and my sister gave it back to me this year. She wanted to know if I could quilt it for her, well, or fix it. So originally she said it was just a top. She thought it was just a top, but it has been quilted. And it's funny because I even left the jump stitches in it from where I went block to block. I never trimmed those off. So I just trimmed those off today, and because the ruffle is connected on the top but not on the back, it's going to give me enough clearance to go ahead and reconnect this to this machine. And I'm just going to do a quick overall design over it. I'll probably pick something that's holiday-ish, and then I'm going to cut this ruffle completely off of the quilt, and then I will rebind it in something that's red. I will machine that part on, but I'll have my friend do the handwork who does that for me. But anyway, I just wanted to show you that A, I've been quilting for a while, and B, we all start somewhere, and we don't start off great unless you're really, really exceptional. There's a learning curve, and these beginning pieces and the middle pieces and our current pieces all help to show our story arc, our learning curve, and I think that's a really wonderful thing. When we look back throughout history, we really fall in love with some of the really primitive quilt pieces that people made, and they're so endearing to us, and yet we criticize our own work when it is less than perfect. Now, of course, through history, we also have examples of Baltimore album quilts and amazingly pieced quilts, but I don't imagine those were done by beginners. So don't beat yourself up as you're learning. It's just such an incredible process. What we are going to be working with today is I'm going to be using the embroidery module to do a quilting design. And that is one of the talking points, I guess, today, is that Urban Elementz has so many different formats for delivering quilting designs to you. Now, they started out with paper pantos, and in the beginning that's all we had. They were all by Patricia Ritter. She was the creator of the whole thing, and she couldn't find designs that she wanted, so she started creating her own, and they all started as paper. And then we got into digital designs for computer systems, and as many of you who do digital work know, we have multiple file extensions for different types of machines. My particular setup is I have a Bernina, but I have an IntelliQuilter on there, so mine is IQP, my design file that I use for my machine. So we have the paper and we have digital designs. We also have a wide selection of quilting stencils. Now, these quilting stencils could be used for any type of handwork, like hand quilting, shishiko, or big stitch style quilting, by utilizing that stencil. The stencil could also be used on the long arm with the magic chalk or some type of a marking pen to mark directly onto the quilt, and then erasing the line when you're finished. And when I say marking pen, I mean like a water erase pen, or ones that just evaporate after time. Certainly not a regular pen. So we have stencils. Then we have design boards. Design boards are meant to be used with the stylus, and the stylus is specific to your machine setup, and those boards connect end to end in the back of the machine, and the stylus goes in the groove. Groovy board, design board, they're all the same type of instrument, and they allow you to replicate a design almost perfectly, because you are basically with the stylus in the groove. You really can't make a huge design error with those unless you really hit the machine hard and knock it out of the groove. Then we have the tearaway designs. Tearaway designs are basically the same type of quilting design. It could be an edge to edge, or a block, or a corner unit, as all of the other elements could be. But the tearaway are single-use designs. That means that once you stitch over it, you tear it off, and you no longer have that to repeat. But you do learn muscle memory while you're working with that, and the tearaway can be used either on a domestic machine, as I have shown in other videos, or on the long arm machine, to help you get comfortable on the front of the machine doing free motion work. Even though you have the paper there, you're following the paper to the best of your ability, but it does help you learn muscle memory. All of these things are meant to be a spirit guide for you. If you're off a little bit with the tearaway, or with a paper panto, or with a stencil, that's to be expected, and that's part of the process, is learning, this learning curve of improving your skills. So all of these tools are available to help you improve. What we have recently done is also get into embroidery formatted quilting designs. These designs can be loaded into a multitude of embroidery machines, and then you can use those edge to edge or block designs for quilting. Now, I have already shown one video on doing a stocking with one of our quilting designs. It was just quilting right through the stocking and then creating the stocking afterwards. The next thing I'm going to do today is actually using a block design, and the design that I chose was based on the sample that I had, and it's called Cindy's Feathers Crosshatch Block, and it is designed specifically for an embroidery formatted machine. In my case, I downloaded the version for a Bernina. And one of the the obstacles that I have in the studio is in trying to find ways to do videos, to have samples to work on without just having things that I throw away at the end. I easily could just quilt a little patch of a blank piece of fabric and then cut them up for dog bedding, but I don't find that as enjoyable as working on an actual project. It kind of raises the stakes for me when I'm quilting on an actual quilt, so that I'm trying my best not to make mistakes. And I think it's more enjoyable for you, I would hope, to see quilting going on an actual piece. So that's one of the obstacles that I have, is trying to find the time to make pieces or find pieces that I could use as samples, and also have some kind of a finished product when it's all said and done. So when we were doing the blocks for the embroidery machine, I had just finished doing a double wedding ring on the long arm machine with blocks designed for the long arm, and I didn't use the exact same one as this, but that made me want to choose a different one. But I also didn't want to have to do a whole big quilt again, and because I have a long arm, I also don't want to have to do a whole big quilt on the embroidery machine because I have the large machine. I know that the people who are going to be working with the embroidery machine don't necessarily have the room for a long arm, and that's why we're releasing these designs specifically for you. And while I was looking online at an online auction, I found this, what I think is really cute, 1930s sample of a double wedding ring. And it's weird because I think it was like 6 blocks, 2, 4, 6, and somebody just folded it over and made a little table topper out of it. They must have hand stitched the edge because it's all enclosed, and it doesn't have any quilting in it. What it did have when I got it, it was hand tied. So they sewed it together like an envelope or something. It has batting in it, and then they just hand tied it. And what I liked about it was it is large enough for me to show placing a quilting design here in the double wedding ring block without having to do a huge large quilt. I also really like the 1930s, and it's already finished on the edge, so once I do the quilting in these spare spots, then pretty much this is a finished project. So that was a win-win for me. The other thing I will say about when we design double wedding ring blocks specifically, we have 2 different ways of designing. And I don't know what we call this star unit in the middle. Those are usually always the same. There's a component that stitches in here as a single unit. What is different, what are the 2 different types of other designs that we have is for the wedge. Sometimes our quilting design extends on the background and the pieced section of the wedge, all as one melon unit. The other type is that there's no stitching on the pieced unit, it's only in the background. There's no particular better or worse on those, it's just that they are different, so you would want to pay attention to that. Also on mine, the one that I'm doing today is just going to be quilting on the background units in the white. I think I'm going to be using a Kelly green color to match these squares as my quilting. Traditionally this would be done in white or off-white, but that doesn't show up very well on camera. So I'm going to be using the green. I won't be doing any stitching at all on the pieced part of the arc. I think with the quilting in these 4 sections and it being such a small piece that won't be necessary. So I'm going to go ahead and get my machine turned on, probably switch the tables out, or at least move this one out of the way, and then we can get started showing you how the design works and the idea of how to get the placement on the blocks with the use of a stabilizer. What I'm going to be doing today is loading plain stabilizer in my quilting hoop. The stabilizer is bigger than the hoop, and I'm going to be using a mid-weight cutaway. I've tried it with the tearaway, and obviously that doesn't work because when the stitching goes on the tearaway, it perforates the paper and then the template would fall apart. And that's exactly what tearaway is meant to do. It's meant to tear away from the stitching with all those perforations. But that's not what we want for this. We want a cutaway, and I'm sure there may be other types of stabilizer you could use as well. But the tearaway or the cutaway maintains its shape even though it's stitched all over. And I'm actually going to be using thread because I want to see the color of that come through my quilt sample. I want to be able to see where I'm placing it. So I'm going to be using a cutaway. I'm going to make a template. I'm going to sew that design out first just on the tearaway, cut it to fit the hoop perfectly when I'm done, as I'll show you, and then I could use it as a template for placing each of these blocks as we go forward. If I was going to resize the blocks in any way, I'd probably have to make another tearaway sample because that's the importance of having this template. So we know exactly what size it is and we can see for placement. As you can see, we have our 770 Bernina with embroidery module. You also could see that we used our tattoo elements on the Bernina to give it a little bit of decoration. This is the cherry blossoms that we have on here, and it comes with a variety of pieces to coordinate with whatever you're decorating them with. These decals stick onto the machine. They are permanent on the machine until you remove them, and when you remove them they leave no residue. They are not reusable the way a post-it note is. So if you place them on and take them off, that one's going to curl up and you're not going to be able to use it again. But they're a great way to personalize your machine, especially if you have a situation where you are in an area with a particular dealership like a Bernina or FAF or some other type of dealer where multiple people are bringing in the same type of machine. It's nice to have identifiers on your components so you get home with your foot pedal and not somebody else's foot pedal. So I kind of like it for that. I always like it also for service. If you take it in for service, you know you're getting your equipment back because it has these identifiers on there. Basically what we're going to start today first with is making this placement guide, and I'm using a cutaway so that when I'm done stitching it the paper is still stable enough. It's not going to perforate and fall apart where the design is. I used red thread on this one, but I've switched over to a green. Unfortunately I don't have a nice Kelly green like this 1930s, but I think that the other green will work fine. So the first step is I'm going to cut a piece of stabilizer a little bit longer than the hoop. It's wide enough to do the whole piece, and then when I'm finished I'm just going to draw a line on the paper around the hoop and then cut that out so that I could place that with the plastic template in the hoop when I'm positioning the hoop for the quilt itself, so I know that I'm getting the design exactly where it's going to stitch up. So that's going to be the first thing I'm going to do. I'm going to pop out this one and reload the cutaway, and then we can get started opening the design up and stitching out our template. I have my cutaway stabilizer in my hoop, and I'm going to go ahead and put the hoop on the machine. It may ask me to lift the hoop off as it's doing its registration, but we'll see when that happens. I've turned my machine on and I have my USB stick in, One of the neat things about the Bernina 770, it has a stylus, and it just has a little magnetic holder right on the side, so I always know where that's at. But we could go ahead and hit the USB stick, and I'm going to go ahead and open up Cindy's Feathers block. And I have multiple versions on here just because there's different sizes, but the Bernina lets me size it so I don't have to worry about that too much. So here's my design, and you can see it coming almost all the way out to the edge of the hoop. So if I put the template on there, I can get an idea of what size that is. So I have to find my piece of template real quick. As you can see, I have hooped my cutaway stabilizer. I also have my template plastic in place, and I can go ahead and also put my template plastic over top of the quilt sample just so I can get an idea of how big the design needs to be to fill the space. So I have my design pulled up. These designs were downloaded from the Urban Elements website. I purchased them. They were in my downloadable products. I went to my downloadable products, downloaded them onto my computer. I opened up the file that I needed for my machine and sent it to a USB stick, safely removed the USB stick from the computer, and inserted it into the side of the sewing machine and turned the machine on. It came up in my USB files. So now I've selected the design, and now I'm going to go ahead and do some editing on it. So I want to make it just a little bit bigger than what it is, and so I'm going to go ahead and hit the sizing function, and I'm going to increase it. I'm just going to go to 150%. I'm looking at the grid to make sure that it's approximately the size I'm going to need for stitching this design out on my block. And that may be a little bit of trial and error for you, but that is what I've determined for mine. If it doesn't work, I can just put in another piece of cutaway stabilizer and do another sew out. So I'm going to remove my plastic, and I'm going to get ready to actually sew. So the computer just resized it, got it ready to stitch out, and we're ready to hit the start button and let this design stitch out. So I'm going to put my template plastic aside. I'm just pulling this thread out so it doesn't stitch over it, so I have a pretty template. I'm just adjusting the speed a little bit. This particular design is going to take about 6 minutes to sew out. So I'm going to go ahead and let that stitch out, and then after this is finished we could go ahead and make a little pencil line on the inside of the template so we could use that as our template guide for future placement. As you can see, I have my design stitched out on the cutaway stabilizer, and now I'm just going to take a pin and right on the inside of the hoop I'm going to draw a line so I could cut that out and just use that as a template that I could reuse over and over again underneath the template plastic for the hoop that will be my placement guide, so I can put this directly on the quilt sample where I need it, and I'll show you what that looks like after I get it cut out and my first one ready to go. This is what I'm going to try and do first as my quilting design. I have my template. You can see I cut it out on the line, and I can see through the cutaway enough to be able to position the quilting template in the block. So I'm going to do that very carefully, and then I'm going to try and keep that straight as I am positioning the fabric in the hoop, and if I have to, then I'll make adjustments with that. I think I've got this close to where I need it. So after I get that, I'm going to tighten up my hoop, and then I'm just going to double check. And I need to go up just a little bit, and my hoop's already popped out. And this is probably going to be the part that takes the most time, is getting that template right exactly where you need it. Now I could reduce the size of the design and make it float inside a little bit, but I really want to try and get it as close to the edges as possible. And I think I've got there. So now I could take my template out and my template plastic and carefully take the hoop back over to the machine and see if we could stitch this out. This is my moment of truth. I'm going to go ahead. I have the hoop loaded back on the machine, and we're going to see if we can get this to stitch out again just the way it did. Again, this is going to take about 7 minutes to stitch this out, and we'll see just how good I did with the placement. know if that segment recorded or not, so I'm going to repeat it. But as you can see, we got the block stitched out. I used a green thread, which is a high contrast thread, for this sample so that you'll be able to see it. Normally, I would have used a low contrast thread, white or ecru. One, because in 1930s they would have quilted in white or ecru. Also, as I'm learning this process of placing embroidery formatted designs in the hoop, it'd be nice to have a little cushion of a low contrast thread. But for the benefit of the video, I used a high contrast thread. So we could see that the placement came out fairly accurate. Especially with an old block like this, it's kind of a little lopsided. It's not necessarily going to fit in there perfectly. But I have this done. There's 3 more blocks to do, so I'm going to skip ahead and do those next 3 blocks with the same crosshatched block design, and then we'll see if we have time to do some of the wedges, melon balls. So here are the steps. First, we make a sheet of cutaway stabilizer to fit the hoop we're using. We're going to sew out the block design approximately the size we think we're going to need it, and we can use the grid on the template to get a quick measurement in accordance with the block that we're going to use. Now, I will say one thing that I've definitely learned in this case: going a little bit smaller on the embroidery module is easier than trying to go the exact size of the block. When I'm using the Bernina Q24 to do digital blocks, I can use the ruler right against the edge of the block to map out the block, but you can't do that on the embroidery module with the ruler. There may be another way with the software, but with the template here, we print this out. I've done it the exact size, which made it a little bit harder. After I did that, I used a pencil and drew the inside of the hoop frame, and then I was able to cut out the template the size of my hoop frame. And that way you can try and get a pretty good positioning on where the block is in the block below. Now I can see this one's a little bit more to this side than it is to that side, but it's pretty close, so I'm going to go ahead and sew this out. This is not going to be an heirloom project when it's finished. It's just going to be a little table topper that my mom can use in her room, and some of the blocks are very accurate and some are not as accurate. But this is a learning process, and I don't like to do videos where we just edit every mistake out and show you all the wonderful ways things work in the end once you learn. I want to show you that there is a learning curve and that what some of the steps are. So if we can get an accurate cutting on the template, an accurate placing of the hoop, then we can do a fairly good job. And it looks like my hoop has popped out, so I'm going to reposition that. But if we can get this on the quilt top good, and then we can get it in the hoop accurately, which I have to redo, then we can get a pretty good placement. Now, I've been showing you high contrast thread, and I'm going to continue doing that on this block. But some of the other blocks are much different in size. This melon wedge here is 6 inches high, but the 2 on the side are barely 3 1/4 inches high. That's just because the skill level of the piecer of the double wedding ring quilt top was not as accurate, but I'm not concerned about that. It's still a very charming piece. So after I do this green one, I'm going to switch over to a white thread and do one with low contrast, which will clearly be beyond the scope of the block itself. Now I could resize it for each one, but I just want to show you the difference of using high contrast and low contrast thread, certainly when you're doing something new and you have a learning curve. And we'll be able to see clearly how the mistakes are more glaring with the high contrast thread. So I'm going to go ahead and rehoop this, and then we'll put it on the machine again. Okay, I have what I believe is to be a really good hooping this time, and I've got my design ready to start stitching again. So I'm going to go ahead and select the start button. This is only going to take 2 minutes because it's such a small portion of the block. Now with a perfectly square block or a round block, you're not going to have too many variations, although you will have more rectangular blocks when you're doing something old or with somebody who's just learning how to piece. But with a double wedding ring, you are going to come up with so many different shapes and sizes, so you're going to be able to get pretty close design ideas from designers who've made double wedding ring blocks, but they're never going to fit exactly in every single rendition of a double wedding ring block. You can see this one was a little more off-center, this one's more centered, but these two here are very small. This one's really only about 3 inches, that's about 3.5 inches. So you could go ahead and redraft your size to fit in there. But I'm just going to show you one where I'm changing the thread color, and I'm going to change it to white and show you that just the high contrast and low contrast thread color is going to make a difference in the visibility of the accuracy of your work or the machine's work or the designer's work. Okay, this will be the last one I make you watch. It is still sized at 150% of what the original design was, and the reason I did that was because this block, the center block, I sized at 150%, so I know that the matching block would also be 150%. But that's going to be much bigger than what this wedge is because this is an ill-shaped block. I'm using a white thread, which is low contrast in this case, and I'm going to stitch it out, and it's going to be too big. It's going to extend beyond the background at least 1 inch on each side. And I know this is a mistake. I could easily have resized it, but what I wanted to show you was that in using a low contrast thread, your mistakes show less. And that's why I always recommend low contrast thread, certainly while we're learning. So we started with a pre-made little sample. It's a double wedding ring sample, which I thought was charming, even though the assembly of this top was not perfect, far from it. In fact, I think that makes it more charming. So the center block were different shapes on each block. The melon wedges were drastically different shapes, some of them almost double the size of others. As I said, we have a lot of block designs, both for digital, stencil, design boards, tearaway, paper pantos, and now for the embroidery module. If you want to play with one of these designs, especially the digital and the embroidery module, you can go to the Urban Elementz website. If you look under the subcategory of free, under the quilting designs, you're going to see probably, I don't know, 50 or so different designs that you could download depending on your format for practice. There are both blocks and edge to edge. So we have paper printouts there for doing paper pantos. We have digital designs for the computerized long arm machine, and we also have designs now for the embroidery module. And they can be downloaded and you can practice. Now, I always recommend practice on just solid sail fabric rather than waiting to get to a project and then practice on that. I know I do that sometimes in the studio, but that's just that's me. I do that to try and make myself focus, but also I just don't like working on scraps all the time for the purpose of video, which is my primary thing. I would end up with a bunch of scraps around here, and I wouldn't like that. So you can download the blocks and practice with those. Again, you could use a high contrast thread as you're learning, just so you could really see where your mistakes are. But when you actually get to working on a project, in the beginning, I would recommend a low contrast thread. And by that, I mean that the thread matches the fabric you're working on in value. So if it was white, it would be a white thread, or a very light color. It could be a pastel pink or a very pastel lavender, very light, as long as it was low contrast. High contrast thread would be a very dark green on a light yellow. It's not the color, it's the amount of light or dark in it. The bigger that contrast, the more your mistakes are going to show. Now, on this sample, I have quilted all 4 of the blocks and these 3 wedges. This wedge you can't see from where you are because I used the white thread. And even though that particular stitch out went an inch below and an inch above the wedge, you can't see that there's an error there because it's a low contrast thread. Where my placement was off a little bit on the others, then that's where it shows. Another thing we learned was that if you're learning, certainly try and go with a little bit smaller size of the design than the block you're trying to fill. That way, if your placement isn't 100% accurate, it's not going to stitch into the piecing part of the block surrounding it. So I tried to get the largest one possible, and where it was off a little bit, it shows more. So by using low contrast thread, that would help. By shrinking your quilting design a little bit smaller than the size of the block you're trying to fill would be better also. We used stabilizer. This is a cutaway stabilizer. The tearaway won't work because it's just going to perforate and tear once you get the stitching in it. So first we did the design. The nice thing about this is if you sew this out and you see that it's too big for the block, you just have to use another piece of stabilizer. If you were trying to scrimp, you could just move the design, do it in a different color thread, and then when you cut out your shape of the template, you would just know that you're using the blue stitch out rather than the green. So that's just a way that you could save on some of your cutaway if that's a cost factor for you. Then we cut it out to fit the template, the size of our template, and that helped us do our placement. So I hope that helped a little bit. Again, I don't like to edit out all the mistakes because I don't think we are actually teaching you anything. If we just show you, you load it in the machine and magically it stitches out perfectly, it's not always going to do that for you, and it's because it wouldn't have done it for us either. So there is a learning curve to using it, but it does expand the vocabulary and the library of your designs when you're able to use your embroidery module and stitch these out. I also would not want to do like a super large quilt, like a king size. I wouldn't want to try and manage that in an embroidery machine. But smaller pieces, a lap quilt, a table runner, a little wall hanging, you could certainly do. This is just going to be a little table topper. So thanks for joining us in the studio today. I hope this was educational, and we look forward to seeing you back here in the studio. Until then, take care of yourself and take care of each other. Are you getting ready to die?